Hello, this is Dr. Martell, and this lecture will be about books 2 and 3 of Augustine's On Free Choice of the Will. I'm going to begin, though, with a bit of review of Book 1. Book 1 begins with a question that Evodius asks of Augustine, and the question is God the cause of evil? That question is meant to indicate to the reader what this whole work will be about, the problem of evil. It indicates, moreover, that the book will be principally concerned with a certain version of that problem, a version of the problem of evil that's known as the holiness problem. And this is the problem of how God can be anything other than an evildoer if God creates the world and the world has evil in it. Augustine responds to this question by making a distinction between two kinds of so-called evil: evil suffered and evil doing. And he argues, too quickly it turns out, that evil suffered is not genuinely evil at all. It's in fact a good thing because it is the just punishment for evil doing that God gives to human wrongdoers. Okay, so it's a good thing because it's just punishment. Now, there are important counterexamples to that claim. Augustine realizes this, and so he's going to come back to this issue of whether evil suffered is all really like good, right? In Book 3, right? And he'll deal with those counterexamples there. But for now, he just sets evil suffered aside and focuses his attentions on evil doing, which at this point looks like it's the only genuine evil. Evodius then asks the next predictable question, and that question is, well then, why do human beings do evil? Why is there wrongdoing? Right? And he asks this question because he suspects that God, right, being the creator of absolutely everything else that exists, is somehow going to be the cause of this too. He suspects that God is ultimately going to be the cause of human evil doing, the only genuine evil that there is. In which case, right, God would be an evildoer. God would be responsible for the genuine evil that there is in this world. Augustine responds to this question: why do people do wrong? By first trying to get clear on what wrongdoing is. And after a very lengthy argument, he concludes that it amounts to acting on desire for that which we can lose against our will, contrary to reason. Okay. Acting on desire that is contrary to reason is acting on what's called an inordinate desire. It's a kind of disordered desire. Okay. Acting on such a desire is also acting contrary to eternal law. Okay. Eternal law for Augustine is law that is one rather than many. It's unchanging. It's neither comes into existence nor goes out of existence. And it holds that all things be in due order. Okay. This law, as it applies to the human psyche, requires that reason rule and desire submit to the dictates of reason. Okay. If you act on an inordinate desire, then, right, you're acting contrary to reason, which should rule the soul, and thus acting contrary to eternal law. Right. One of the things this means is that, according to Augustine, people who do wrong, they are preferring something to eternal law. They're preferring something, right? Specifically that comes and goes, right? That we can have and lose in time, to that which is eternal. So we are in a way showing preference for temporary things to that which is eternal. Hopefully this will remind you a bit of Plotinus's account of what I've called ethical evil. Right? Ethical evil is evil for which responsibility can be assigned. I think I said that in the lecture on Plotinus that ethical evil for him, or actually the first lecture on Augustine, ethical evil for him is a matter of overrating, okay, material things, right? Like showing preference to them, for them, showing preference for them over immaterial things, which are actually better. Okay, I take it that Augustine at this point is saying something quite similar. After all, what are these temporal things for which we show preference when we do wrong? I mean, they're pretty clearly going to be things like money, right? Wealth in other forms, like material things, power, fame, like physical health, right? Friends. All of these things are in one way or another physical, or they depend upon, for their existence, they depend upon like material stuff, right? And so Augustine, even in Book 1, in his account of what wrongdoing is, shows that he's been influenced to a considerable extent by the Neoplatonists, maybe by Plotinus in particular. Right? Okay, given that is what wrongdoing is, why do we do it? Augustine responds to that question, finally, by introducing a third part of the human psyche. So we've got reason and desire so far. The third part he calls the will. And the will he understands to be the power of choosing. Okay. He furthermore argues that the will is an entirely self-determining power. What that means is that the manner in which this power is exercised is not determined by anything other than the power itself. It is not made to act as it acts by anything other than itself. It is not constrained to act as it acts by any power other than itself. And so it is, we could say, free. Okay, so the will is free. And so Augustine ultimately answers the question of why it is that people do wrong by saying free will. When we do wrong voluntarily. We freely choose to do so, right? That's the cause. Right? Okay. This then leads to the very last question that Evodius raises in Book 1, and the question is a quite understandable question, given what Augustine has argued. I mean, he's argued that the only genuine evil is wrongdoing, and he's argued that the free will is the root of all of that evil. Evodius' question is, well then, is it a good thing that God gave us that power? I mean, like, after all, it's the root of all evil. It sure seems like it's not good that God gave us this power. And if it's not good that God gave us this power, if indeed like it's a bad thing that God gave us this power, and it sure seems like it's a bad thing, this would mean that God, right, is responsible for evil. Okay, and so the holiness problem has not yet been solved. Okay, but what we need to do is we need to show that it's somehow a good thing that God gave us free will. In Book 2, Augustine means to show that. So at the beginning of Book 2, again, this question is raised. Is it a good thing that God gave us free will? And to answer that question, Augustine tells Evodius that he's going to have to answer three questions, really. The first question is this: does God exist? The second question: do all good things come from God? And the third question is the free will among them? Okay, he's going to argue yes, yes, and yes. So I'm first going to turn to his argument for the existence of God. Then to his argument that all good things come from God, and then finally his argument that the free will is one of these good things. Augustine's proof of the existence of God is a very, very strange proof, right? Especially to contemporary readers. I mean, like present day readers. If you hear about these days the proof of the existence of God, you're probably going to expect an argument that is at least intended to convince atheists or agnostics that something like the God of Christianity exists. Okay, uh, it's true that a good many of the arguments for the existence of God that can be found in the history of Western philosophy are like that. They are actually arguments that are intended to convince even non-believers. Okay. Augustine's argument is, I'm sure, not like this. It is not an argument that's intended to convince an atheist or an agnostic or even anyone who is not already a pretty orthodox Christian. Okay. Given what I know about Augustine and given what I know about the details of the proof, I just think there's no way he could have intended, right, that the argument convince, right, anyone other than someone who was already like a Christian. Okay. After all, like, Augustine's like a highly intelligent philosopher. He also spent much of his early adult life teaching rhetoric, which is the art of persuasive speech. If you look at the details of this argument that he gives, this proof, right, there's just no way that this thing could have persuaded anyone again who wasn't already a Christian. So that's not what's going on here. What is going on? What's he trying to do? My suspicion is that Augustine, instead of trying to convince the non-believer that the God of Christianity exists, he's instead trying to convince people who already believe in the God of Christianity to believe something else. What he's actually trying to do is addressing this argument, constructing this argument for like Christian readers. He's trying to get these readers to buy into a certain metaphysical scheme. And that metaphysical scheme is one that is derived largely from so-called Neoplatonic thought. Okay. He will then try to use that metaphysical scheme to solve the problem of evil. Right. That's why he wants to get Christian readers to accept it. Right. Because that'll put him and them in a position to solve this problem that they have. Okay. So the proof is a very strange one, and it goes as follows. The first premise is that if there is anything superior to rational life, then either it is God or there is something even better than that, and that's God. Okay. Second premise, so the second piece of evidence in the argument, is that there is something superior to rational life, namely number and wisdom. Conclusion is either God exists and just is, like number and wisdom, or there is something even better than number and wisdom which exist, and that which is better than them, which also exists, that's God. Okay, so and either way you go, right? Like, God exists. Again, this is a very strange argument, and it's not an argument that would convince a non-believer, especially these days. So what's going on here, right? A certain metaphysical scheme is being introduced, right? And that metaphysical scheme, again, is going to help Augustine solve the problem of evil. To explain what this metaphysical scheme is, I want to first focus attention on that first premise. If there's anything superior to rational life, then either it is God or there is something even better than it, and that's God. Okay. That premise implies that there is a hierarchy of beings, right? That is, like, among the beings that make up the world, right? There are some that are better than others, and it implies furthermore that rational life, which Augustine's readers would have at the time identified with human life, rational life falls somewhere in this hierarchy. Like, it has some rank, right? Possibly above some things, possibly like below other things. Okay. And as a matter of fact, like at the time that Augustine was writing, the idea that beings like fell into a hierarchy and humans were somewhere in that hierarchy. That was a widely accepted idea, and it had been a widely accepted idea probably for millennia, right? After all, for millennia, people in this part of the world had believed in gods, and they believed that gods were immortal and self-sufficient, and so were superior, right, to mortals, including those which are rational human beings, right? So it was widely held that the gods are higher, right, of higher rank in this hierarchy of beings than human beings, right? But it was also assumed widely for a long time that that human beings were not of like the very lowest rank. No, actually we're of a middle rank, because there are other beings who are inferior to us, namely like non-rational beings, such as non-rational animals, plants, and inorganic stuff, right? Furthermore, it was also assumed that a sign of superiority was dominion, ruling, okay? And so, right, a sign that the gods are superior to human beings is that the gods rule over human beings. They, in one way or another, like order our affairs, right? And a sign that human beings are superior to non-human beings other than gods, right? So, like non-human animals, plants, inorganic stuff, is that we impose order, right, on those beings, right? Like we sort of structure how things go with them in order to serve like our ends. We have dominion over them. Okay, so superiority goes with ruling. One thing is superior to another when one thing sort of gives the rule to the other. Okay, so that's what's going on with that first premise. Second premise. Number and wisdom are both superior to rational life. I'm going to set aside wisdom to keep things relatively simple and just focus on this claim that number is superior to rational life. Okay, what Augustine's assuming here is that numbers are beings. Okay, they're entities of some kind or other. He is probably assuming that they are not bodies. they're not formed matter. He is probably assuming that they are like immaterial beings. So something like a denizen of the intelligible realm in Platonist thought is being assumed here, right? Numbers, you recall, belong to the intelligible realm as opposed to the visible realm. Numbers, you might also recall, hopefully you do recall, they belong to the second hypostasis of Plotinus as opposed to the first and the third, right? Second hypostasis, that's the hypostasis of thought and being, and the beings in question are like forms as well as mathematical and geometrical objects. Okay, so that second premise then is telling us there are numbers, right? And they're superior to rational life. Now, why would Augustine claim that they're superior to rational life? That they're higher in this hierarchy of beings than human beings? And his answer is that they give the rule to us when we exercise our power to reason, especially when we calculate. If we want to get at the truth in our calculations, if we want to get at the truth where numbers are concerned, we have to look to and obey truths that pertain to the numbers themselves. If you want to calculate well the numbers there are of things that you can actually sense, things belonging to the visible world, like bodies, right? You have to look to the numbers and identify truths holding for them, right? And so, number gives the rule to rational life. Number exercises a kind of dominion over rational life insofar as we as rational beings attempt to calculate, right, accurately, okay? And so the conclusion is, right, either numbers exist and they're God, or numbers exist and there's something even better than numbers, and that which is better than numbers is God. Okay. Augustine, I don't think ever answers the question of which it is in Book 2 of On Free Choice of the Will, but my suspicion is that his view is that actually, like, both those claims are true. It's both the case that God is number, and it's also the case that God is superior to number. So let me try and explain this, and hopefully this will make clear just how much of Plotinus' thought in particular Augustine is taking over here and trying to render plausible to the reader. So again, in Plotinus' thought, there are three hypostases. The one, right, then thought and being, and then finally like soul and bodies. Okay. You recall that the one is it's good. It's numerically one. Doesn't come into existence or go out of existence. It's unchanging. It's perfectly uniform. and we can't say much more about it than that. Okay. It generates the second hypostasis insofar as it knows itself. Okay. Knowing is a good thing, so the one as good, like, knows, and of course, like, the best kind of knowledge is the best kind of thing, so the one knows itself. Knowing itself, thinking of itself, right? Having episteme regarding itself, the one generates the second hypostasis. Knowing introduces difference, right? And that's something that's new. That's something that you can't find in the first hypostasis. Minimally, knowing introduces the difference between the knowing and that which is known. Thinking and that which is thought. Okay. Also, to think of something is to always to think of it in one way, like, rather than another. Okay. So thought inevitably introduces multiplicity, plurality, many, which amounts to introducing number. Okay. Everything that's thought, insofar as it is some number, is an image of the one, but it is not itself the one. Okay. How is everything that's thought that is a number an image of the one? Well, two ways. For one thing, this is something Augustine explicitly says. I'm not sure it's true of Plotinus, but it's something Augustine explicitly says. That every number is just a multiple of ones, right? So 2 is 2 ones, 3 is 3 ones, and so forth and so on. Right? So every number is just a collection of units, right? The one is that which is perfectly unified, and so every number, insofar as it is made up of units, is an image of the one. Furthermore, right, each particular number is some unified collection of units, right? So to think 3 is to think a collection of units, 3 of them, together, right? It's to conceive of them as unified. And so, right, thinking 3, we have actually like two images of the one, right? We have an image of the one insofar as 3 is a unity of units, and we have an image of the one insofar as every one of those units in the collection that is 3 is itself an image of the one. Okay. So how does this explain this curious conclusion of Augustine's that like either number exists and is God, or there is something even better than number, and that's God. I think what Augustine wants to say, following Plotinus, is that both those claims are true. God is number insofar as God is that unity that every number is an image of, right? God is the primordial unity, right? From which like every number derives its being. God is the primordial unity that generates, right, every number. So God is number. But at the same time, God is something different than number insofar as God as this primordial unity is something different from any particular number that is an image of that unity, such as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like you get the idea, right? So God is number, right? If by number we're talking about like primordial unity, the one, and God is something also superior to number. If we're talking about God as the one and comparing that to the particular numbers that are generated by the one at the level of the second hypostasis. Okay, so right, what Augustine again is here trying to do is he's essentially trying to sell important aspects of a Neoplatonist metaphysical scheme. Okay, so God exists and essentially has the status, the Christian God, according to Augustine, of the one in Neoplatonic thought. Okay. The second question that he wanted to address in Book 2 was this: do all good things come from God? And the answer is going to be yes. Like, why? Well, according to Augustine, absolutely everything that exists, in order to exist, must be unified. It must be one. It's got to be, then, an image of the one. It can't be without the one. The one, again for Augustine, that's God. So everything that exists, insofar as it exists, it has to be unified. It cannot be unified without this primordial unity that it is an image of, right? So I mean, in a way, like according to Augustine, everything that exists only exists because it is made in the image of God. Right? Furthermore, right, recall that for Plotinus, that second hypostasis of thought and being was not just of like knowing and numbers. It was also like knowing and forms, like the form of virtue, the form of justice, and so forth. Okay, those forms, that's the stuff of what Augustine calls wisdom, right? So wisdom amounts to things like the form of justice or the form of virtue, right? He goes on to argue in Book 2 that everything that exists, right, like aside from God, not only in order to exist has to be unified. Everything that exists, right, especially if we're talking about like physical stuff, right, perceptible beings, right, it has to be formed in one way or another. And actually, like everything that we can perceive it's formed in multiple ways. So it cannot exist without being of form, and it cannot exist without being like unified. Okay, this means that everything that exists that we can perceive, right? It's an image of number, and ultimately like one, and it's also an image of forms, which are themselves, we know, familiar as we are with Plotinus' thought, like images of the one. Okay. God, for Plotinus and Augustine, is one. God's also good. Okay. What this means then is that like everything that in any way depends upon God, insofar as it like is an image of God, made in God's image, it has to be good too. And so Augustine's view is that like absolutely everything, insofar as it is an image of God, insofar as it is informed, right? So it has some form, insofar as it is of some number, insofar as it is unified, it's all good. And so, right, is everything, do all good things come from God? That was the second question that was meant to be addressed in Book 2. Augustine's answer is yes, because his answer is that absolutely everything that comes from God is good. And there is nothing except that which comes from God. Right? So what Augustine has essentially argued here is that basically like the whole of being, all of it, right? It's either God or it derives from God. And this means that like the whole of being is good. Okay. So yes, all good things come from God, because everything comes from God, right? and anything that comes from God is good. All right. Last question: is the free will among the good things? Okay. Like we already know, insofar as it comes from God, it has to be. Okay. But Augustine, what he next does is he explains in detail how this can be so. And what he argues is that free will is that which makes for a great good thing that would otherwise not exist in the world. What it makes for is what you could call like moral good. Okay, moral good is good for which, right, agents can be held responsible. They can be held responsible for it insofar as they do it of their own free will. They do it, moreover, with a certain intention, the intention of abiding by eternal law. Okay. So here's another way of putting it. The moral good is good that free agents do because they recognize that it is the right thing to do, that it is the good thing to do. Okay, that is a kind of good that is both very, very great and would not exist but for the fact that there are beings such as ourselves who have free will. Okay. One more thing about this. Augustine's view is also that humans have a certain nature. We have in still other words, like a certain essence. Okay. Recall that Aristotle's like Greek for what gets translated as essence is something like the what it was to be. Okay. Essence has to do then with like not just how we are, but how we should be. Right. Augustine's view is that insofar as we have free will, humans are essentially beings, right, who are supposed to, right, of their own free will, do the right thing because it is the right thing to do, right? It's free will then, right, that allows us to basically fulfill our essence, like basically like satisfy the demands that our essence makes on us, right? So human beings who do that which is morally good, right? They sort of like fully realize themselves as the creatures they were made to be, right? That's his view. Okay. So that's why then it is good that God gave us free will, right? It's not just right a good thing. It's a great good thing because it is the condition of the possibility of a very, very great good, right? The good of like morally right action. It would be impossible, right, without it, without free will. Right? So in a way, what Augustine is saying here is that God giving us free will is basically like justified in view of the greater good that free will makes for, the good of morally right action. Okay. This leads Evodius to make an objection, and I think this objection, when we consider it, should help to make clear why it is that Augustine felt the need to bring in this Neoplatonic metaphysical scheme. Okay, and Augustine's objection is this. Well, I can accept all of that you just said, but I see a problem here, and the problem is this. It seems like God could have given us free will in such a way as to ensure that we would never misuse it. Like the idea is that it is properly used, right, in order to bring about this very, very great good of like morally right action. Okay. As a matter of fact, in the world that God has created, right, like people sometimes do that, but sometimes they misuse the free will, and instead of like fully realizing themselves as the creatures they were made to be, they do wrong, right? They act contrary to reason, pursuing their desires, and thereby contrary to the eternal law, like they do evil. Right? What Evodius suggests is this. It seems like God didn't have to make the world that way. It seems like God could have made like many, many different worlds. And before making any of these worlds, God could have like foreseen exactly what the beings populating those worlds would do, freely of their own free will. And it seems like God could have made a world from among all those worlds that were possible where perfectly free beings, right, only ever use this power well, right? They only, they're free to do so, but they only ever, right, freely make good choices. They never freely make bad choices, okay? It seems like, Evodius says, if God were like perfectly good, God would have created that world, right, where people are sort of like angels, right? They have free will, but they only ever use it well, right? They only ever choose to do good. It seems like if God were perfectly good, God should have chosen to make that world rather than this world, okay? And so it seems like God, in making this world, didn't do as well as God, given what we Christians think of God, should have been able to do. Okay. In still other words, what Evodius is suggesting here is that God is an underachiever. Right. God's an underachiever if God fails to make like the very best world possible. Evodius is suggesting that it was possible for God to make a better world than this one because it's possible for God to have created free beings who only ever choose well, as a matter of fact. Okay, Augustine's response is to say that this hypothetical world, this world that Evodius is imagining, would be better. A world where people are basically like angels or saints, which is probably a better analogy. That world would not actually be a better world. Okay, like why not? Augustine argues as follows. Okay. Real human beings, the human beings that we find in this world, are not all like angels or like saints, right? Sometimes we use this power of free will well. Sometimes we use it like poorly. Sometimes we sort of live up to the essence that God has given us by doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Other times we prefer the temporal to the eternal, like we do evil, right? So God, in making us, has not made us perfect. Right? We are not as good as we possibly could be. We're no angels. Not all of us are saints. But, right, even imperfect beings, such as human beings who do evil, are good to some extent. Right? This follows from what has already been said about God. Right? Again, all good things come from God. Why? Because everything comes from God, and anything that comes from God must be good, right? Because it in a way like shares in God's goodness. It's an image of the Creator. Okay. That means that to use like more Christian language, right? Even sinners, while imperfect, must be good to some degree. Right? Okay. The one, God, in God's generative activity, brings into existence as much good as possible. Right? That's actually what Christians think. Right? Had God only created angelic humans, saint-like humans, okay, God would have thereby missed an opportunity to create. In this hierarchy of beings, that's sometimes called, it actually came to be called the Great Chain of Being by later philosophers. In this hierarchy of beings, there'd be like an empty rung. Right? An opportunity for doing good would have been missed by God. Right? God is not like that, according to we Christians. Every opportunity to create that which is good, God takes. And so, right, while this may seem not to be the best of all possible worlds, because humans are no angels, right? In fact, it is. Because it's a world in which God has basically exhausted God's created possibilities, right? This is a world that is as full of being, which is good, as possible. Right? So God is no underachiever. Okay, that then leads me to book 3. There's more to book 2, but I want to go ahead and kind of simplify things by skipping ahead to book 3. Book 3 is going to return to this issue of whether evil suffered is really evil. Okay, but before doing that, it's going to raise another problem that's related to the problem of evil, and this is known as the foreknowledge problem. Evodius again raises it right at the beginning of this book. The problem can be expressed, as with problems of evil, in argument form. And the argument goes like this. if anyone, including God, knows that someone is going to do something, they're going to do it. Actually, let me like rephrase that to emphasize something. Necessarily, right? If God knows that you're going to do something, then you're going to do it. Right? After all, we wouldn't say that God or anybody else like knew that anything was going to happen unless, right, what they knew actually does transpire. Okay, so necessarily, if God knows that you're going to do something, then you're going to do it. Okay. Well, right, for anything that you do, God would have known, right, like beforehand. Okay. After all, God is omniscient, right? So God is surprised by nothing, right? Everything that you do, God already knew that you were going to do that. Conclusion: necessarily, you do what you do, right? Put it a different way, for anything that you do, you have to do it. You have to do it, okay? This includes acts of wrongdoing, okay? So it looks like for everything that you do, or anyone does, that's evil doing, wrongdoing, they must do it, okay? If you must do it, if you have to do it, it sure seems like whatever ultimately makes you do it, that's got to be God. And so it seems that we haven't in fact solved the holiness problem. Why? Because God's foreknowledge of evil action seems to imply that evil action is action that the agent must do. And if the agent must do something, it seems like God, who created the agent and the whole world, like ultimately has to be responsible. So Augustine, he doesn't actually at this point get into the details of this argument to show like why it is that it fails. Like it is in fact a bad argument. The argument involves a logical fallacy having to do with what are called modal terms. And modal terms are terms like necessary and possible and so forth. And as a matter of fact, like human beings, when arguing using those terms, very frequently like make mistakes in reasoning. And there's a mistake in reasoning like in that argument. Augustine doesn't go into the details of what the mistake is, but he does point out that there has to be a mistake in the argument. And there has to be a mistake in the argument because he maintains that the conclusion is contradictory. And the conclusion again is that for whatever anybody does, they are forced to do it, right? They must do it, okay? Yeah, including evil doing, okay? Augustine says that's contradictory because we have already agreed that evil doing is a matter of voluntarily, right, of one's own free will, acting on inordinate desire in violation of eternal law, right? It is contradictory to say that somebody is compelled to do that which is voluntary. And so the argument has to be fallacious. It has to involve an error in reasoning because the conclusion is not just false, it's necessarily false, right? It's a contradiction. So Augustine accepts the law of the principle of non-contradiction, right? Okay. Right. He then takes one further step, which has proved to be extremely important, perhaps unfortunately so, in the history of philosophy. Right. So what he has said to this point is that the conclusion is contradictory because it's contradictory to say that voluntary action is compelled or coerced. And I think he's right about that. He then goes on to say, right, that no. Voluntary action is never coerced. Indeed, far from being coerced, it is not caused by anything. It's uncaused. Literally, nothing makes it happen, right? that's Augustine's view then of free will, right? It's the power of will exercised, right, in an uncaused fashion, exercised in such a way that, again, like nothing other than the will itself makes it happen. Right? This theory of the will, that it's free in this way, like it's uncaused, that has like set in motion a debate about free will that has continued to this very day. The debate is about not just like whether such a notion even makes any sense. It's also a debate about whether, right, humans really do have like free will, like in this sense, like whatever sense this notion makes. Right. Having dispensed thusly with the foreknowledge problem, Augustine then returns to this issue, this question of whether all evil suffered is really good. And it's at this point that he finally acknowledges that there are some important counterexamples to make to that claim. The counterexamples that he considers are the suffering of non-human animals and the suffering and death of human infants. Okay, he acknowledges that in both cases, the suffering in question cannot well be understood as just punishment for the evil doing of the being who suffers, right? And so it looks like, right, we've got here two cases of evil suffered that isn't good insofar as it is God's just punishment for the transgressions of the being who suffers. So in still other words, it looks like we've got here two cases of evil suffered, such that that neither is good. Okay. About the suffering of animals, Augustine argues that it is good, in fact, but not for the same reason that other evil suffered is good. No, the suffering of animals is not God's just punishment of the animals for evils that they have done. After all, Augustine thinks like they don't have free will, right? So they can't be evildoers, but like at least in such a way that they can be like held responsible for it. And indeed, they can't be evildoers at all because like his view of evil involves acting on desires that are contrary to reason, and these beings, like according to him, like they don't have reason. So what's going on here? He argues that the suffering of animals is nonetheless a good thing because it is instructive to human beings. He says that when animals suffer, they respond to pain by basically trying to get themselves out of the circumstances that are causing it, and thereby survive. Right? This is instructive insofar as it shows human beings that animals have been designed. They've been built to achieve certain things, like survival and reproduction and so forth. Okay? That's important because Augustine thinks beings built to achieve certain purposes could not have come about by chance. If there's design in nature, there has to be a designer. And so the suffering of animals, that's like an argument for intelligent design. It's sort of like an argument for the existence of God. The suffering of animals is a good thing, according to Augustine, because it shows human beings that there's a God, that God exists. So, actually, what Augustine is doing here is he's making the sort of argument that Stoics made for their god, Zeus. Like Zeus was not for Stoics like an arbitrarily adopted assumption or anything like that. Stoics argued that in nature, right, we can find all sorts of beings that are clearly built to achieve certain goals, right? They exhibit design. There could not be design without a designer. Human beings have not designed these things, so there must be like a more intelligent non-human being that is responsible for the design that we find in nature. Yeah, that being is what the Stoics called Zeus, right? Augustine adopts this Stoic way of reasoning in arguing that the suffering of animals is in fact a good thing. Not good because divine retribution for their wrongdoing, good instead because, right, providing human beings with evidence that there's a God. As for the suffering of and death of human infants, Augustine wants to say this. No, that cannot be God's just punishment for the wrongdoing that infants have engaged in this life of theirs, right? Because they haven't yet reached the age of reason, okay, and also in many cases they've done next to nothing. Right? So it's not a good thing for that reason. Okay. However, it is still a good thing. It's not bad. Here's why. It could be divine retribution for the sins of the parents. That is, it could be the case that this is punishment directed not at the infants who suffer and die, but at their parents, right? And surely their parents, as human beings, have done things that are wrong. Okay, so this could be a good thing, insofar as it is divine retribution, not for the evil doing of the infant, but for the evil doings of the parents. But he also says, though, look, just because the infant hasn't done evil doesn't mean the infant isn't guilty and thus deserving of punishment. That's the other thing he says. And this gives voice to Augustine's view that there is such a thing as original sin. That's kind of one of his innovations as a Christian philosopher. This notion of original sin. So Augustine's view is that original sin, strictly speaking, is the sin of the first human beings, Adam and Eve, in alienating themselves from God by acting contrary to God's will. And so, like, there's that story about God clearly forbidding Adam and Eve from eating of that one tree, the fruit of that one tree, right? And Eve is talked into it by a serpent, and she eats of the fruit of that tree, and then convinces her husband Adam to eat of the fruit of that tree, and that's the big transgression that results in the fall of human beings. That's the original sin. It's the first sin. It's the first instance of evil doing, I think Augustine wants to say. And Augustine's view is that all the descendants of Adam and Eve inherit responsibility for that act. And so humans, according to Augustine, since Adam and Eve, are born sinners. As sinners, they're as such like deserving of suffering. And so, right, one way or the other, the suffering and death of infants is, according to Augustine, actually not really evil. It too is a good thing. So I want to conclude this lecture and these lectures on Augustine by making a couple of comparisons between his thought and the Roman and Greek thought that came before him. And I also want to say a few things about his philosophy, such that it anticipates developments in medieval philosophy. And all of what I have to say here concerns Augustine's view of the fall of human beings, right? In other words, it all has to do with his view of original sin. As I read Augustine, original sin cannot have been committed out of ignorance. It can't, because I know Augustine was very familiar with the Genesis story, and I know that in the Genesis story, Adam and Eve both know that God exists. They can actually, they're said to see God, like on a daily basis, like walking through the garden every evening. So God is a being, their creator is a being who's quite present to them. Right? So there's no doubt or ignorance about this. Additionally, near as I can tell, in the garden there's only one rule, and it's very, very clear. Right? Basically, like, they can do anything, but there's this one tree, and it's got fruit, and they're not to eat of the fruit of that tree. And I believe that the tree is the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Yeah. So they're not supposed to partake of that. Okay. They choose to do it anyway. Right. So what this means is that, according to Augustine, it is not the case that evil doing is ultimately a mistake. That is like an error in judgment, an act committed out of ignorance. No, it's an act committed in full knowledge of what the relevant rules are. The first humans choose to break those rules anyway, knowing full well what they are and who gave them. Okay? So evil doing for Augustine is ultimately not a matter of ignorance. And indeed, if you think about his solution to the problem of evil, like evil doing, it can't in general ultimately be a matter of ignorance, because if it were, it would be blameless. It would be exculpatory, right? People who act out of ignorance are ordinarily not to be blamed for what they do, and ordinarily not punished for what they do, right? Augustine can't have that, because Augustine, he's compelled to read almost all of the evil that there is in the world that is suffered as God's just punishment for wrongdoing. Well, then the wrongdoing, right, can't be blameless. It can't be done out of ignorance, right? And indeed, according to Augustine, ultimately it is not, right? It's not done out of ignorance. There's not a failure of knowledge here, right? Instead, it's done out of malevolence. Ultimately, right, evil doing is a matter of bad will. Perhaps, and this is what the story in Genesis suggests, perhaps it's done out of a kind of inordinate desire, sort of maybe like a lust for power. After all, at the end of the Genesis story, when Adam and Eve have been expelled from paradise, from Eden, God does various things to prevent them from coming back, and specifically God is supposed to prevent them from coming back and eating of a different tree, And basically that's the tree that's such that if you ate the fruit of it, you would become immortal, like God, right? And so perhaps, right, um, um, evil doing is ultimately motivated um, by by a desire to become like God oneself. So a desire for like very, very, very great power. But in any case, it's ultimately rooted in malevolence, which is just bad will, not ignorance. Okay, I think that's a that represents a break from Greek and Roman philosophy prior to Augustine. On my reading of these philosophies prior to Augustine, evil is ultimately explained as a mistake, as a failure of knowledge. It's action out of ignorance, and this holds true for Plotinus as well, right? Again, as I explained in the lectures on Plotinus, ethical evil for him seems to be like an understandable mistake that embodied souls having to deal with bodies make. We're going to tend to, as embodied beings, overrate material things. Overrating material things, preferring them to immaterial things, right? That's ethical evil. Yeah, all of this is understandable, an understandable error given our situation, right? That is not Augustine's view. Okay. There's another, though, important break from previous Greek and Roman thought, and this has to do with the power that God is supposed to have, according to Augustine. And I also referred to this difference between Augustine and previous philosophers in a previous lecture. I don't think, according to Plotinus, that the one is ultimately responsible for the generation of matter. I think that according to Plotinus, the one is ultimately the source of whatever form matter comes to have. But it doesn't make matter. Matter is already on hand, and then it gets formed up, right, through the generative activities of the one. Right? Plato, in the Timaeus, sketches a similar view, right? What does the demiurge do? Takes matter on hand and works it up while looking at the forms so as to resemble the forms as much as possible. The matter's already there, right? The forms don't create it, the demiurge doesn't create it. Aristotle's God, the unmoved mover, right, is not supposed to be a being that had like anything to do with like bringing matter itself into existence. The matter is already on hand. We know for the Epicureans, right, that atoms are the archai. They're the source of everything that exists, and they're eternal. They don't come into existence so material things for the atomists, for the Epicureans in particular, they are not generated. Like they just are. Anything that's generated is generated like out of them. Right? That is not Augustine's view. Augustine's view is that God creates absolutely everything else that exists, right, from nothing, including matter. Okay, and this means that for Augustine, there really can only be ethical evil, like evil for which like agents are responsible. There can't be what I called in a previous lecture metaphysical evil, right? Evil stuff for which no being is responsible. Perhaps according to Plotinus, matter, insofar as it always lacks form to some extent, it is always unformed to some extent. Perhaps it is like just evil stuff, right? For which no agent is responsible. After all, right? Everything that's an image of the good is itself good to some extent. The opposite of the good would seem to be like bad or evil, and so perhaps matter, right, is an example of metaphysical evil. There can be no such evil in Augustine's scheme of things. All right. Okay. This is important, very important actually for later medieval thought, right? That God is like so powerful that God can bring absolutely everything else into existence, including matter, out of nothing. Okay. In the course of later medieval thought, this notion of God's omnipotence, this notion of being God being all-powerful in this way, it runs up against the idea, one, that human beings can understand very much or know very much about God at all. And so, strangely enough, it leads to a kind of religious skepticism among Christians themselves. And two, it leads to something in medieval thought that's called nominalism. Nominalism, whatever else it is, it involves a rejection of essences, right? Whether they be like Aristotle's essences or Platonic forms. Okay. So let me explain briefly. God's omnipotence runs up against the idea, it works against the idea that God can be known very well at all by human beings for the following reason. Later figures came to hold that God being omnipotent implies that God's creative power is in no way exhausted in creating this world. So the limits of God's abilities, where creation is concerned, they are not the limits of this world. Right? God's power actually far exceeds the power to create like this or any other world. Okay, so we cannot understand this world as the limit of the exercise of the Creator's generative abilities. Okay, then, if this world doesn't represent like the limit of what the Creator can do, it's a lot more difficult to read off from this world what the Creator is like. Right? This world, how we find it to be, doesn't give us much of a handle at all on what the Creator is like. If this world were like the limit of what the Creator could do, right, then we could read off from, right, characteristics of the creation, characteristics of the Creator. But since it is not the limit of creative powers exercised, we can't infer from what the creation is like very much at all about what the Creator is like. Secondly, like we have to reject anything like the theory of forms or even Aristotelian essences. And we have to do that for the following reason. Even philosophers like Augustine, who claim that God is omnipotent, even they think God in generating other beings is really constrained to only generate like one set of forms, like and sort of like one set of numbers and geometrical objects too, right? Like no other forms are possible for God to generate out of God's oneness than those. Okay, well, of course, those forms are what God in generating perceptible beings has to rely upon in creating those perceptible beings. After all, perceptible beings they're formed matter. Okay, formed how? Formed vis-a-vis their archetypes, which are the forms. Okay. Later philosophers, Christian philosophers, of the Middle Ages viewed this theory of forms as impious, because it suggests that God's power is limited, right? And so to avoid the impious, like irreligious notion that God's power is limited in this way, right? There just are these forms, and however God creates the world, creation has to exemplify those forms and no others. In order to avoid that irreligious, impious idea, they ended up rejecting forms, Plato's sense, or even essences in Aristotle's sense, right? And they ended up holding instead that things like justice and beauty and virtue and so on, rather than being forms or essences, those are only words. And so this is where we get nominalism from in the Western philosophical tradition. It originates in medieval thought, and it's an idea that is inspired by this notion of Augustine's, right? That God can create from nothing. And if you think about it, in some ways it's a revival, oddly enough, of sophist thought, right? So you not only get religious skepticism, we cannot know very much about God at all. This follows from God being all-powerful. But additionally, whatever measures we rely upon in judgment, they're not measures that are out there in the nature of things, forms or essences. They seem to be measures that human beings, right, have chosen to work with. The human is the measure of all things.